Good morning. We are here at Sutter's Fort State Historic Park. We're going to get started in about a minute or two as we get people logged on here. In about a minute, we'll start just a few seconds after 9 o'clock. For now, I'm going to pan around and show the fort here as we have a nice day here today in Midtown Sacramento. For those that are here already, you could use the raise your hand icon at the bottom of your screen. Raise your hand if you have visited Sutter's Fort before. Raise your hand if you have visited Sutter's Fort before. And that's okay if you haven't, because raise your hand if you have visited or live in Sacramento. There we go. We have some people for that question. It's a nice day, but a little bit chilly here. We're going to get started in just a couple seconds here. It looks like it's 9 o'clock. We could get started. Well, good morning, everybody. We are here at Sutter's Fort State Historic Park in the middle of Sacramento, California. For perspective, I am standing a mile east of the state capitol building, and then a mile beyond that is Old Sacramento State Historic Park, where the California State Railroad Museum is. You're probably wondering, who's this guy talking to me right now? I'm going to turn my camera around. Good morning, everybody. My name is Jared Jones, and I am the coordinator of our school programs here at Sutter's Fort, which is part of the California State Park System. Sutter's Fort is currently closed right now because this is at 9 o'clock in the morning. We open at 10 o'clock. We are open from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day. And we are going to learn today about how and why John Sutter and other European Americans came to California in the 1830s and 1840s, and the role that Sutter's Fort played in California history. Now, I want to show you real quick outside Sutter's Fort so you can get an idea of where I'm at here in Sacramento, because if you were to visit Sutter's Fort in person, and I hope my program inspires you to visit Sutter's Fort in person one day, and you were to walk around, you would see that everything looks like it's the 1840s. But the second I turn my camera around here and step outside this big gate, you will see that we are in the middle of a big modern city. We have big buildings that tower over the fort today. None of these buildings existed in the 1840s. None of these buildings existed in the 1890s when Sutter's Fort was rebuilt and became a museum. There wasn't really any buildings outside the fort until the early 1900s, but there were small structures outside the fort in the 1840s. There were tents and shacks everywhere because that's actually where workers lived and slept. Only John Sutter and a couple workers actually lived within the walls of the fort. When the sun went down, people went home. But I want you to see where these cars are on the street. They are downhill from us. Sutter's Fort was built on a high hill, a hill that was more prominent in the 1840s than it is today. But you wanted to build on high ground because Sutter's Fort, and later the city of Sacramento, was built near the confluence of two major rivers. A confluence is where two rivers meet. Those two rivers, the Sacramento and American rivers, then surrounding the fort. We have these 15 to 18 feet high, originally made out of adobe, mud brick walls. And they're painted white with a lime wash paint to protect the bricks from the winter, because adobe is essentially sand, clay, and straw all mixed together and dried in the sun. So you want to make sure you have a lime wash paint to protect it. So if you visit other Adobe historic sites, such as the California Missions, or some of the structures at Old Town San Diego State Historic Park, or some of the structures at Monterey State Historic Park, or Adobe in Red Bluff, or the Sonoma Barracks in Sonoma, they're all painted white with a lime wash paint. But also Sutter wanted to have to make sure that the walls were very white, because he wanted to make sure the fort could be visible up to 1 mile to 2 miles away, which was possible because remember, there was no buildings outside the fort in the 1840s. He wanted the fort to be visible because Sutter's Fort was actually a business center and a trading post. This is where people came to work and to trade goods. And while we do have cannons around the fort was never attacked. But maybe the fort was never attacked because we have those cannons. But John Sutter actually visited quite a few different forts before coming here to the Sacramento Valley. So he knew what a fort looked like. You have a big building in the middle. That's the central building. That's the original part of the fort. We're going to see some of the rooms of that building during this program today. And then you surround a courtyard with 2 walls. And then you build a roof between those 2 walls. And there you have rooms for all of your shops, such as a cooper shop, a carpenter shop, a blacksmith shop. I'm going to explain what I mean by all that as well during this program today. I'm going to head on over here to my main presentation spot. And as I'm walking over here, I want to acknowledge that Sutter's Fort State Historic Park was built on the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Nisenan, Miwok, and Maidu Native people. I'm going to explain what I mean by that as well during this program today. I'm going to set my phone down. And yes, I'm about to set my phone down on top of a metal tub, which is on top of a barrel, which is on top of a wooden table, because that's what I have for a phone stand, folks. There's that central building, the original part of the fort. I'm going to turn the camera around to me, and we are going to learn about this man, John Sutter. The man the fort is named after. John Sutter was born in February 1803 in Kandern, which is a small village on the border of what is today Switzerland and Germany in Europe. He grew up in a Swiss household by 1826. He had married his wife, Anna. They have 5 children, and he opens a dry goods store, which is like an early grocery store. And by 1834, he's in a lot of debt. I mean, a lot of debt. He owed the bank anywhere from $25,000 to $50,000. There was an economic depression in Europe at this time. An economic depression means the economy has collapsed. People are losing their businesses. They're losing their jobs. And this is when hundreds of people leave Europe and go to the United States looking for a better life. Sutter, though, is about to go to debtor's prison before his wife helps him secretly gain a passage aboard a ship going to New York. And Sutter leaves his family in 1834, and he doesn't see them again until January 1850, 16 years later, when his family comes to California. Now, but those 16 years that Sutter is away, he plays a key role in not only the development of the Sacramento Valley, not only the development of California, but of the American West, because of the events that this place, Sutter's Fort, is associated with. So he gets to New York in 1834, and I'm going to quickly talk about Sutter's journey to California, but don't worry, folks, not much of this is going to make any sense, because I've worked here at Sutter's Fort now for over 8 years, and I still don't understand that this is the route that Sutter took to get to California. So he gets to New York in 1834. He quickly moves on to the westernmost point of the United States at this time, which is Missouri. Here's a little bit better of a map for you. This is the United States. And this is what I mean by the United States at this time. Missouri is the farthest state west. What becomes later the Western United States is claimed by other countries at this time. Oregon and Washington is claimed by the British, and Mexico is California and Texas are being claimed by Mexico. Mexico has gained its independence from Spain in the early 1820s, and California is not just California that we know of today. It also consisted of the land of Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah, parts of Colorado and Wyoming, It's this large land area, but the Mexican government claiming California is only living along the Pacific coast, near where the former California missions are. The mission system had been abolished in 1834, and it was the rise of private land ownership, where the Mexican government was giving out large chunks of land to people known as land grants. Sutter hears about California and the prospects of land when he's in Missouri, and he decides he wants to go to California. So in 1838, he travels overland with some fur trappers along much of what is later the Oregon Trail, and he arrives in Fort Vancouver. Fort Vancouver is the Hudson's Bay Company fort on the border of what is today Washington and Oregon. So he has completely overshot California, but he decides he really wants to go to California from there. So he gets on a ship to Hawaii. I know that doesn't make any sense. Why would you go from Fort Vancouver to Hawaii to get to California? But that's how the trade routes worked at this time. There was no California Trail yet. You did not travel to California by land. And Hawaii was a major trading hub. Ships from all over the world traded goods there. It's like the central point in the Pacific Ocean. That's where Sutter's going to be able to get on a ship going to California. Except when he gets to Hawaii, he misses that ship to California. He actually spends several months in Hawaii. He becomes friends with King Kamehameha III, the king of Hawaii, and he gets 10 Hawaiian workers to help him on his journey to California, 2 of whom were women, and some of the Hawaiians' names were Manawiki, Mainawiki, Ellen Mahuka, John Kelly, Maintop, Sam Kapu, and Harry. And they became some of Sutter's first workers here in California, and they actually ended up holding pretty significant roles in the fort's history. Now, Sutter was able to leave Hawaii when he traveled by Russian ship going to Fort Sitka in Alaska, which is owned by the Russian-American Fur Company. I know this still doesn't make any sense. He's gone from Fort Vancouver to Hawaii, now to Fort Sitka in Alaska. But from there, Sutter was able to captain a Russian ship traveling down the Pacific coast. He drops off goods at Fort Ross. I'm going to talk about Fort Ross in a little bit. And from there, he journeys on to Monterey. He arrives in Monterey on July 2nd, 1839. He has to go to Monterey because this is the capital of California at this time. Monterey was the capital. Sacramento is the capital of California today, but in the 1830s, it was Monterey. And right there is the customs house, and all ships coming to California, Sutter's coming to California by ship, has to declare their cargo there. And this is where Monterey State Historic Park is today. So Sutter arrives on July 2nd, 1839. He throws a big party on the ship. He invites the whole town, including the governor, Governor Juan Alvarado. And Sutter meets with the governor, and he impresses the governor because Sutter has letters of introduction from all over the world. Sutter has letters from Alaska and from Hawaii and from Fort Vancouver and from Missouri. All of these letters say that he is the real deal. Because after all, he told everybody that he was captain of the Swiss Guard under King Charles X of France, even though that never existed. Sutter was very good at creating a false image and a lie about himself. And somehow it worked, because when he met with the governor, he said, I would like to live in the interior of California, not on the coast, like where the Mexican government is. The governor says, okay, because the Spanish and later Mexican government had tried 5 times to settle the interior of California, and they failed every time. They thought Sutter was going to fail too. So in August of 1839, Sutter and a few dozen people aboard a couple boats, they leave Monterey and they travel to Yerba Buena. Yerba Buena is now known today as San Francisco. They travel through the bay to the Delta, to the Sacramento River, and they travel north. And they travel north on the Sacramento River until they reach the confluence of the Sacramento and American rivers 2 miles west of here, where the American River flows west into the Sacramento River. And they notice 20 feet in the air and the trees, driftwood, and debris. This area must flood all the time. So they start to travel up the American River a little bit, looking for higher ground. And the people aboard the boats, they start to get very afraid. Not only are they getting bitten by mosquitoes left and right, but they start to see about 300 California Native Americans assembling along the banks of the river. They think there's going to be an attack, but there wasn't an attack, because the only people that got off those boats on August 12th, 1839, everybody else turned those boats around and went back to Monterey. The only people that got off the boats were John Sutter, those 10 Hawaiians, 3 sailors, oh yeah, and a large bulldog. That was Sutter's landing party. Sutter immediately met with the chiefs of the local native villages. He gave them gifts and he told them his intentions. He is to be living here in this area of the Sacramento Valley, and he's claiming this land is his. He's claiming land that thousands of Native Americans have been living on for thousands of years, and according to Native oral tradition, since their creation. Now, this is the unfortunate chapter of American history. As people moved west, they claimed land without any regard to those that were already living on it. The indigenous native population. Sutter was a part of this. Sutter was a part of initiating colonization here in the Sacramento Valley. Now, we know the 3 tribes that inhabited the Sacramento Valley and who inhabit the Sacramento Valley to this day as the Miwok, Nisenan, and Maidu people. But they're actually not known by these large tribal names yet. These large tribal names come about in the early 1900s by anthropologists. When Sutter gets here in 1839, he writes that there are 30 different unique California Native American villages living at different points along the rivers and streams on the land that he was going to claim as his. And some of these village names are the Momoy, the Sakum, Sama, Hawk, Kadima, Omachumne, Kasumne, and McCollumne. And it's many of these villages that came and worked for John Sutter, probably out of their own survival, as California was already drastically changing before Sutter arrived here. But they are the ones that actually built this place. And some of these villages did tell Sutter that this area floods all the time. You want to build on high ground. So they brought Sutter to this high hill. That's why I showed you at the beginning of the program, the street was downhill from us. This is where Sutter was living out of a canvas tent. The Hawaiians built a couple grass huts until construction begins in 1840 on the central building, which is the original part of the fort. This building was incredibly important for Sutter to continue living here in this area. Now, in 1840, Sutter became a Mexican citizen. You got to be a Mexican citizen in order to live here in Mexican California. After all, he became a representative of the Mexican government. His title was alcalde, which is like a mixture of mayor and sheriff at this time. And with a permanent structure like the central building here, this was able to show that Sutter was trying to properly homestead, that he was then able to apply for a land grant. And he applies for a land grant in June of 1841 that he gets, and he doesn't pay a dime for it. He gets it by being a representative of the Mexican government in this area, a land grant of almost 50,000 acres that he named New Helvetia, which means New Switzerland, named after where he grew up. And this is a map of New Helvetia. And this is where the fort was at the southern point. There was 60 miles between the southern point and the northern point, which was the Sutter Buttes in what is today Sutter County. This was a massive, massive land grant. And now that Sutter has legal title to land, he wanted to start building a fort. And what better way to build a fort here than to just buy another fort that exists in California? In December of 1841, Sutter purchased Fort Ross. Fort Ross is the Russian fort just north of Bodega Bay, about 80 miles north of San Francisco on the California coast. In 1812, Fort Ross was built by the Russian-American Fur Company, but by 1841, they thought they weren't making any money in California anymore. So they sold Fort Ross to John Sutter for $30,000, and they left. And Sutter sent workers to move everything from Fort Ross to here. And now when I mean that they moved everything from Fort Ross to here, I don't mean that they actually moved the fort. Fort Ross is made out of redwood. We're made out of adobe mud bricks. I mean the stuff. I mean the tools for a cooper, carpenter, and blacksmith shop, a rope making machine, a grist mill for grinding wheat into flour, about 2,700 head of cattle, horses, and sheep. It's everything that Sutter needs to have a fort here. Except he doesn't really have any skilled workers to do a lot of these jobs yet. He has to start making some quick money. He has to start making his payments for Fort Ross. And the quickest way that you could make money here in this area at this time, because there was already trappers in this area, was to literally trap animals for their furs. And the animal that drove the fur trapping industry ever since the mid-1600s was this guy. In the 1650s, French fur trappers came to North America to trap this animal because they had already wiped out the population in Europe. And they gradually moved farther and farther west over the years. By the late 1700s, American fur trappers had formed trapping companies and were trapping this animal across the Rocky Mountains. By the late 1820s, trappers had come to California to trap this animal. Now he lives along rivers and streams. He's got this big old tail that he uses as a tool to pack down limbs and mud on his lodge. He also uses his tail as a balance so he can lean on his back legs and chew on wood with these big old teeth. And he has to keep chewing on wood with these big old teeth because his teeth actually grow and grow over his lifetime. If he was to stop chewing on wood, his teeth would grow into the other side of his skull and he would die. He has to stay busy as a beaver because this is a beaver pelt. This is what drove the fur trapping industry. And they were trapping this animal to make a certain clothing item. And it was a clothing item that not that many people expect. Now, these pelts, they didn't stay here in California. They were being shipped out of California. They were taken to the coast, loaded onto trade ships, travel all the way around the southern tip of South America. There's no Panama Canal yet or anything like that. And then travel up north to big cities like New York and Boston, where in these haberdasheries, they'd take the pelts on these large willow rounds where they were kept very taut. The long guard hairs would be plucked off, revealing the soft hair underneath, which would be shaved off, boiled in a mixture of mercury and urine. Yes, I said mercury and urine, to help the hair bind together and make a felt-like material to fit to a mold to make hats. And the most popular at this time, top hats. You know, Abraham Lincoln's top hat is made out of beaver felt. This is what drove the fur trapping industry. And these hats would take about 4 beaver pelts to make a hat this size. Now, these hats were selling for $75 to $200 in the early 1840s. Now, that's something that a common farmer or factory worker in the United States, they could never afford. They're only making about 30 cents a day. This is for a business owner, a factory owner, a politician. This was a sign of wealth. And not only was the trapping of beaver incredibly destructive on the environment, these trappers were only concerned about making money. They were not concerned that they were completely eradicating the population of an animal and changing the ecosystem for everything else. The trapping of beaver was incredibly destructive on the indigenous native population, as many of these trappers introduced European American diseases into villages. And it was also destructive on the hat maker. As a hat maker working over a boiling pot that included mercury, I don't know if you know what mercury is. I'm not talking about the planet. I'm talking about the element on the periodic table. It's technically a metal, but also a liquid. They used to use it in old thermometers. And when they're boiling it, the fumes are going into the air. The hat maker is breathing it in. It's going right to their head, causing all types of psychotic issues, which at this time would have been considered mad or crazy. And that's where you get the term mad as a hatter, is from these beaver felt hat makers. So if you know of Alice in Wonderland and the Mad Hatter, he is not an angry hat maker. He is a hat maker that has been poisoned with mercury during the hat making process. There was another animal that was trapped here in this area. It's this guy, the river otter. Sutter was able to get about $5 for a pelt like this, and he's trading these with trade ships on the coast. This is how he's able to obtain materials that he can't easily get here in California, such as iron for the blacksmith shop. Now, these otter pelts are being taken to Hawaii, where they were traded with Chinese merchants. And by the time this reaches China, it's worth about $50. And it would be used as the cuffs and collars on fancy silk coats. And these otter pelts were being traded in Hawaii for silk, porcelain, tea, and spices from China. And silk enters the international market as a fabric and becomes all the rage. Everybody wants to have a silk shirt, a silk scarf, a silk top hat. What do you think this does for all these fur trappers? It's not really a reason to be trapping animals anymore. Plus, they've wiped out the population of a lot of these animals, leading to a lot of these trappers to lose their jobs. And they came here to areas like Sutter's Fort looking for work. And the walls of the fort are not even finished yet at this time. This is still the early 1840s. They're asking Sutter for jobs. Now, Sutter knows that these trappers, they don't necessarily have the skills here that are needed, but they could bring people here that do. Because already by the early 1840s, people were traveling to Oregon by wagon. Maybe you've heard of the Oregon Trail. Maybe you've played the video game. Maybe you don't know what I'm talking about. Ask your parents or grandparents. The video game's been around for a very long time. But people were traveling to Oregon looking for a better life. Remember that I told you that Sutter left Europe in the 1830s because of an economic depression? Now there's an economic depression in the United States, leading to hundreds of people to lose their businesses, lose their jobs, lose their farms. People are moving to cities. Cities are becoming overpopulated. And when you have an overpopulation of people living in close quarters with no modern medicine or modern plumbing, diseases are running rampant. So people are even heading west looking for better health. They're also fueled by racial ideas like manifest destiny, where they think that they can claim any land that they think is open. Now, Sutter wants people to come to California instead. So Sutter sent fur trappers back east to tell people, don't go to Oregon, come to California and we'll take you there. And that's how trappers like Caleb Greenwood, Joseph Childs, James Kleiman became guides to help wagon parties get to California. And that's how Sutter's Fort became the end point on the California Trail. Almost all people coming to California in the 1840s by wagon were ending right here. And that's why I'm holding a model of a wagon. You're probably wondering to yourself at home or at school right now, Jared, what are you doing holding a model of a wagon? I paid good money for a quality program today, and you're showing me a model of a wagon? I want to see a real wagon. You know what? You're right. Let's go see a real wagon. I'm going to turn my camera around, and we're going to go see our 1840s farm wagon. Now, this wagon is not actually from the 1840s. It was made the same way, though. It was made in 2004, so this wagon is now 18 years old. It's old enough to vote. And before I talk about the parts of the wagon, I want to talk about what this wagon represents. Because while this is a symbol of opportunity to some, this is what brought people here to California looking for a better life. It is at an impact on the lives of those that are already here, the indigenous native population. As more people came to California by wagon, it led to further displacement of native people from their traditional homelands, and it led to clashes of culture and conflict. So keep in mind that while this is a symbol of opportunity to some, this can mean something different to other people. Let's talk about the parts of the wagon. The green part of the wagon is called the bed. That's for all of your supplies. And this wagon could hold about 2,000 pounds of supplies. Keep in mind there, I just said supplies. You're not riding here in this wagon. You're walking along the whole way, because if you're riding in the wagon, it means less stuff can be in there. And this wagon is for your whole family. This is for yourself, your parents, your 7 and 9 brothers and sisters. Families were a lot larger at this time. Maybe your grandparents, maybe a couple aunts and uncles and cousins, all sharing this wagon that is 4 feet wide 10 feet long. So after your school day today, I want you to mark off in your home 4 feet by 10 feet and see if you could fit all of your belongings in your wagon to head to California, because it was a 2,000-mile journey from Independence, Missouri, the beginning of the California Trail, to Sutter's Fort, the end point. You would leave in late March to early May, that's springtime. Fresh grass along the trail for your livestock to eat. Then you'd want to make sure you cross the Sierra Mountains before the winter or the snow, arriving here at Sutter's Fort in early to mid-October. Now, attached to the bed of the wagon, you would have these wooden arches called the ribs that you would attach a canvas cover to called the wagon's bonnet. And that's how you protected all the supplies in your wagon. Hooked to the front axle, you would have this long piece of wood called the tongue. And that's how you would hook up your oxen to pull your wagon using a yoke. Now, this yoke is for 2 oxen. You would have 3 sets of these because you would have 6 oxen pulling this wagon. An ox is a male cow that is trained to pull wagons. And you're traveling at about 2 to 3 miles an hour, which is a good speed because remember, you're walking along the whole way, and you're going to average about 12 to 15 miles in a day. Now, we're going to walk around the back of the wagon here, and I want you to think about what would you bring in your wagon for a 6-month journey to California, because I don't think there's any room in here for your bed or your family's prized piano. What would you bring in your wagon? Think about that. What would you bring in your wagon? And I'll give you a hint. There's no grocery stores along the way. There's a couple forts, Fort Laramie and Fort Hall, but supplies there are really expensive. So everything that you're going to have with you is from the beginning. And the most important thing you're going to have is food. And it's going to be dried food. And that's going to make up over half of the weight in this wagon. So over 1,000 pounds is going to be food in this wagon. It's going to be flour, so you can make simple breads along the trail, rice, beans, cornmeal, salt, sugar, maybe some coffee. And I always get asked about, what about fruits and vegetables? They brought some, but they didn't have that much of it. And they actually ran out of it very quickly. So something that a lot of American immigrants suffered from once they got here to the fort was something called scurvy, which was a severe lack of vitamin C from not having any fruits or vegetables. So make sure you eat your fruits and vegetables every day, kids. You would bring hunting supplies to hunt for fresh game along the trail, such as buffalo, deer, and elk. Any excess meat would be dried into jerky for the days that you couldn't do any hunting. You're going to do all of your cooking by campfire in big, heavy cast iron pots like this. Now, this pot weighs 40 pounds. So if you have 3 of these pots, it's 120 pounds weighing down this wagon. So you're not even going to have that many pots and pans to make your simple meals of meat, beans, and rice. And the next day, meat, beans, and rice. And the next day, meat, beans, and rice. You get the idea that you're eating the same thing just about every single day. Now, you're going to bring supplies for repairing your wagon. If it breaks down, you're going to bring supplies for setting up camp. And if your dad is a blacksmith, he's going to want to bring his anvil and all of his tools with him. That's several hundred pounds weighing down this wagon. That doesn't really leave much weight in your wagon for any personal items, when you also have to factor in water. We have barrels of water here. That's water not only for yourself, but also for your livestock to drink. There's no way that you're going to be able to bring 6 months of water with you on your journeys. You're actually going to be traveling along rivers and streams as much as possible for fresh water. Now, water was also important so you could do some washing using your washboard. This is how you washed your clothes. What you do is you'd have this in a bucket of water. You get your clothes wet. You have a little bit of soap up here. Get some soap on there and literally scrub your clothes until you thought they were clean. Now, the thing is, you only have the clothes on your backs and maybe one other change of clothes. Clothing and fabrics were really expensive at this time. If you had a hole in your shirt or a tear in your dress, you'd repair it. You would not go buy something new. And you wore the same thing every day. Your other change of clothes that you had were only worn for special occasions. Now, you'd wash your outer clothing, your shirts, pants, and dress about twice a month. You'd wash your undergarments about once a week. And don't worry, you took a bath about once every 2 weeks. But around the campfire at night, you're looking for some evening entertainment. You are traveling with other families. You're part of a wagon party. Doesn't mean it's all fun and games, just that party is synonymous with group at this time. But around the campfire at night, one wagon might have a guitar, another wagon might have a violin. You had to leave behind your family's prized piano, but at least you brought your washboard that you could play some simple songs like Old Susanna, Stay Away From Me. I'm trying to prevent COVID, so stay away 6 feet. I think that's how that song goes. I've clearly given up a very prosperous music career to be an interpreter with California State Parks. Let's talk about the wheels of the wagon. I'm going to turn my camera around here. We have our grease bucket that would have been full of an animal fat to grease the wagon axles so the wheels move properly. Now, our wheels are made out of wood, but they're protected by an iron tire. This back wheel is 4 feet 10 inches tall. The front wheel is 3.5 feet tall. And look at how high this wagon is off the ground. This is your all-terrain vehicle. This is for crossing rivers and streams, rocks and mud. The higher you have this wagon off the ground, the better. It's going to be underneath the wagon is where you're going to sleep if it's raining. If it's nice out, you're going to sleep underneath the stars. Now, a job that children would have to do along the trail would be to collect firewood to burn as a fuel. But if you're crossing the plains where there are no trees, but a lot of buffalo, children would have to collect buffalo chips, which is dried buffalo poop, to burn as a fuel. But it wasn't always work along the trail. There were games that children played, and they did have toys. It's just out of the materials that they had. So in your wagon, you had dried beans and you had old cloth. So you can make simple bean bags for a bean bag toss or for juggling. This is the extent of juggling you're going to be able to get out of me. You also have old cloth that you can make a simple rag doll, not a very nice doll. Keep in mind, most people coming to California didn't really have nice things. This is probably something that a child made on their own, or me. But maybe you've heard of the Donner Party. The Donner Party is the most famous wagon party to attempt to come to California in 1846. They get trapped in the Sierra Mountains in the snow where Donner Memorial State Historic Park is today. Half the wagon party perished, but they were eventually rescued by men from Sutter's Fort and brought here. And Patty Reed was an 8-year-old girl that traveled with the Donner Party. This is Patty Reed as a teenager, but she was 8 years old when she traveled with the Donner Party. She brought with her a small doll that fit in her apron pocket. It was just under 4 inches. It's typically on display in our museum room here, but she's out in quarantine right now. Her doll is made out of wood and has a very nice dress. It's a lot nicer than my rag doll, but the Donner and Reed families were a lot more wealthy than most people coming to California. And there is a book that a lot of children read in the 4th grade called Patty Reed's Doll, that a lot of students read about learning while they're learning about California history. And if you didn't have a rag doll, you might have a corn husk doll or a corn husk action figure. And you can learn how to make your own rag doll or corn husk doll on our Sutter's Fort YouTube channel. I have videos on how to make a rag doll, a corn husk doll, a lot of other activities that you could do at home or in the classroom, and also some other videos to learn more about the fort's history. Now, eventually, you have arrived here at Sutter's Fort. Sutter needs people to stay here in this area. Remember, he's looking for skilled workers. And one of the most important jobs that was needed here at the fort were blacksmiths. In the corner of the fort, we have a blacksmith shop that has a forge and fire of 3,000 degrees. That's 800 degrees hotter than lava. The iron and steel would go into the forge. You'd want to make sure you're handling with tongs. When the metal is bright yellow, that means it's about 2,100 degrees. You'd want to bring it on out of the forge and over the anvil. You'd want to strike while the iron is hot. It shaped the metal into a variety of different tools. Think about what a blacksmith could make. They were like the Home Depot of the 1840s. They were making tools for all the other workers here at the fort. And as this is an agricultural and manufacturing center, I'll tell you exactly what the blacksmith was not making. Armor and swords. Those are blacksmiths from 500 years ago. They're mainly concerned about making the tools for workers here. And outside the fort, there were farmers tending to the agricultural fields. They needed shovels. They needed pickaxes. They needed plows. All those metal parts made in the blacksmith shop. Inside the fort, you had carpenters. Carpenters are the woodworkers building furniture, structures, cabinets, carts, wagons, tables, chairs. They need a way of cutting down trees and chopping wood. So the blacksmith is making saws, he's making axes, he's making hatchets. All these metal parts are made in the blacksmith shop. But look, my hatchet has a wooden handle. That would have been made by the carpenter using something called a draw knife, which is a two-handled blade for shaving down and shaping wood. So you start to see that these jobs are working in unison with each other. The carpenter has to work with the blacksmith to make the finished product. Now the carpenter also needs a hammer for hammering, nails, and a blacksmith could make 1,000 nails a day if that's the only thing that they're making. Think about your main mode of transportation around here is by horse. Each horse has to have 4 horseshoes. Those are made in the blacksmith shop. Think back to the trappers. Those traps made in the blacksmith shop. And think about your kitchen at home. Think about what is metal in your kitchen. Now, I'm not talking about your stove or the refrigerator or anything like that. I'm talking about the utensils. There was a kitchen crew making meals for 100 to 200 workers a day. That's a lot of spoons, forks, knives, spatulas, ladles, anything made out of metal in there is being made in the blacksmith shop. Now, what a blacksmith is not making is cast iron. Like that pot that I showed you over the wagon, that would be made in a factory back east and brought here. And a blacksmith doesn't make anything out of tin. That would be a tinsmith. And there was a tinsmith shop outside the fort making tin cups, tin buckets, coffee pots, stuff like that. Over here, we have a cooper shop. A cooper is somebody who makes barrels, buckets, and butter churns. They're items made out of hoops and staves. The wooden slats called staves are held together by metal or wooden hoops. And this is a small barrel. Think of more wine barrel size. That's more the size that they're making. And this is your standard storage and shipping container of the time. This is how Sutter could sell a barrel of flour, a barrel of pickles, a barrel of nails. This is your Amazon box of the 1840s. It was easier to roll a heavy barrel than it was to pick up a heavy box. But a large majority of the jobs that were here at the fort were actually outside the fort's walls. And at any point in the 1840s, at least 80% of the workforce here at the fort, inside and outside, were Native Americans from the local villages. And they were the predominant ones taking care of the livestock in the agricultural fields. By 1846, Sutter had 10,000 cows that were free roaming around his land grant. They were slaughtering 5 to 6 cows a day to feed the workers here. But the valuable parts of the cow at this time was actually not the meat. It was the hides and the tallow. And that's actually what was backing the economy here in California. The hides are the skin that could be tanned into leather to make shoes, belts, bags, and saddles. And there were shoemakers here at the fort making shoes just like these. These are my Brogans. And these shoes cost $10 in the 1840s. Doesn't seem like much today, but the common worker here was getting paid about 50 cents a day. So could you imagine working 20 days for a new pair of shoes? Which is why if you got a hole in your shoe, you had them repaired. You would not go buy something new. Remember, clothing and fabrics and everything else is made by hand at this time, and it's quite expensive. Now, also from cows, you add tallow. Tallow is the rendered fat, which over a boiling pot of it, you could dip a cotton wick 30 to 50 times to make candles, just so you could see here at night. There's no electricity. You could also make soap from tallow. Could you imagine washing with beef fat soap? I bet that's what our blacksmith uses. There were produce gardens outside the fort growing all types of fruits and vegetables, similar to what you might be able to see at the grocery store today, except for the more exotic stuff. no bananas or pineapples or anything like that. But they didn't have the luxury of having stuff year round. It wasn't in season. They were not eating it. But the largest crop that was grown outside the fort was wheat. Wheat that was harvested, threshed, and winnowed, all of that being done by hand, just so that you could get the wheat berry, which is the kernel, that could be taken over to the grist mill, which were large millstones that ground the wheat into flour. Flour was incredibly important as a trade item, but it was also important to the bakery, which has been this thing behind me this whole time. This is our outdoor adobe brick oven. You would have a fire in this oven for 4 hours to preheat this oven before the fire would be removed and the bread would be baked right in on the bricks. You would start with larger loaves of bread, and as the oven cooled down over time, you would make smaller breads until you made hardtack, which consists of flour, water, and salt. And you can learn how to bake hardtack on our Sutter's Fort YouTube channel as well. I bake it right here in this oven, and I talk about how you can make it at home. So the bakery needs a fire, the kitchen needs a fire, the blacksmith needs a fire. I'm going to show you how they would make a fire in the 1840s using flint and steel. Everybody make a triangle. You need 3 things to make a fire: fuel, air, and heat. If you don't have all 3, you don't have a fire, which is why if you ever find yourself on fire, hopefully you don't, what are you supposed to do? Stop, drop, and roll. Rolling around on the ground, you're trying to take away the oxygen from the fire. If you throw a bucket of water on the fire and it goes out, you're taking away the heat. If you stop adding anything to your fire and it goes out, you're taking away the fuel. So you need 3 things to make a fire. Now, in regards to my flint and steel, now, I'm showing you a historical demonstration. Don't go grab a rock and a piece of metal and start hitting it around at home. This is a lot different stuff. This is a high carbon steel striker made in our blacksmith shop here. When I hit my steel striker against the flint, I get sparks, which are very small and they go away very quickly. I can't just do that over to some wood shavings and grass. I need something to catch one of those sparks. So in my tin container here, I have char cloth. Char cloth is a charred fabric made in a previous fire. It's essentially cloth that's been cooked down and charred, and it's very brittle, and that's what's going to catch a spark very easily. So I've set it here on my flint. And just like that, I have caught one of those sparks. So now I have a glowing ember, which is just kind of smoldering. I need something to help it ignite very easily. So I have some rope here that I've pulled apart and made it very fluffy. This will ignite very easily. And so I'm going to put my char cloth inside my jute rope that I've pulled apart. So now I have my heat and I have my fuel. The last thing I need is some oxygen. You start to see that it's already starting to smoke here a little bit. So I'm going to blow on this. Close it up here a little bit. And that's how you make a fire in the 1840s with flint and steel. I start adding some wood shavings, dried leaves, start adding some small wooden sticks, and start building up that fire and get my oven going. So by 1846, you have lots of different people coming here to California, and it actually leads to a lot of political issues. Keep in mind, this is Mexican California. Sutter is a representative of the Mexican government. It's why we fly the Mexican civil flag here at the fort, which is the Mexican flag without the eagle in the middle. But a lot of these people that are coming to California, these Americans that are coming to California by wagon, they're not becoming Mexican citizens. And it actually leads to a lot of political issues when in April of 1846, General Jose Castro the general of the Mexican cavalry issues a proclamation ordering that all of these Americans that are not Mexican citizens have to leave California by the end of the year. This creates a lot of fear for many of the Americans here at Sutter's Fort and the surrounding area, that they decide to rebel against the Mexican government. In June of 1846, 30 American men and their families from Sutter's Fort and the surrounding area, they banded together, they called themselves the Bears, and they decided that they were going to take over the Mexican Army's headquarters on the northern frontier, stationed in Sonoma, where Sonoma State Historic Park is today. And on June 14th, 1846, those 30 Americans captured the Sonoma barracks peacefully because they had to wake up the 11 Mexican soldiers that were garrisoned there. They arrested General Mariano Vallejo, and they proclaimed California an independent nation. This became known to history as the Bear Flag Revolt. And William Todd, the nephew of Abraham Lincoln, designed the bear flag. It's the precursor to our state flag today. He put on the flag a red star. He wrote California Republic, and he also put on the flag a ferocious grizzly bear. I think William Todd was a terrible artist. And then William Ide, where Ide Adobe State Historic Park today tells the history of him. He proclaimed himself president of the new republic because he was the only one there that knew how to read, write, and ended up drafting the California Declaration of Independence. Stay in school, kids. But this Bear Flag Republic only lasted for 3 weeks because on July 7th, 1846, Commodore Sloat and the United States Navy arrived in Monterey, took over the customs house in Presidio, raised the 28-star U.S. flag, and that began the American occupation and the Mexican-American War here in California. 4 days later, Joseph Warren Revere, the grandson of Paul Revere, brought the 28-star flag to fly over Sutter's Fort. And at the same time, Captain John Charles Fremont of the United States military seized control of the fort, placed Edward Kern in charge, and this became an outpost for the United States military during the Mexican-American War. Now, there were no battles here in Northern California. They were all in Southern California, but Sutter's crops and cattle were used to feed the soldiers. Now, eventually, Sutter gets the fort back in his control in the spring of 1847, once the fighting is over here in California. And he realizes that this is going to become an American territory. There's going to be even more Americans to come live here in this area. He would like to build a town. He had the dreams of building Sutterville, which was going to be south of the fort, but you need lumber to build that town. So we're going to continue our story here in the central building. And as we cross through this door, we are crossing into the oldest building in the Sacramento Valley. And over here in the clerk's office is where John Bidwell, the head clerk, wrote a contract in August of 1847 between John Sutter and the head carpenter, James Marshall, for building a sawmill. The sawmill, which would turn trees into lumber, was going to be located 40 miles east of here along the South Fork of the American River in the Columa Valley, which is the name given by the Yalisumni Nisenan village that lived in the region we know today as Coloma. It is also here in the clerk's office is where workers were paid. They were paid in material goods because there was no paper or coin money here in California at this time. You would exchange days of work for material goods. And because items were all made by hand, items were expensive, but people were not paid very well by comparison. Remember, I told you earlier that the common worker was getting paid about 50 cents a day. So for perspective, this knife from the blacksmith shop cost $1.50. Could you imagine working 3 days for a knife? 2 to 3 days for a tin ladle? 2 to 4 days of work for a wool blanket made on the wooden looms in the blanket factory here? 5 to 7 days of work for a hatchet, 12 to 20 days for a cast iron pot, 20 to 40 days for a saddle. And as I mentioned earlier, about 20 days for a new pair of shoes and about 10 days for a new shirt. Items were incredibly expensive here at the fort, but it is here in the clerk's office is where that contract was written between John Sutter and James Marshall for building the sawmill. And the sawmill was almost complete in January 1848. And on January 24th, 1848, James Marshall was inspecting the tail race. He was inspecting the tail race of the sawmill where the water flows into the water wheel and moves the saw blade up and down. It is on January 24th, 1848, James Marshall found gold at Sutter's mill. Now, 4 days later, Marshall arrives here at the fort with the gold that he found, which were 3 pieces about the size of the tip of your pinky. And here in Sutter's office, Sutter and Marshall tested whether or not that gold was real. They found out that it was, and they tried to keep it secret for about 2 weeks until word gets out and the gold rush begins. And when the word gets out, no longer do people want to be working here for 50 cents a day. They think gold is the size of your fist in the American River. So Sutter is faced with a dilemma. He has no workers here at the fort, and this dilemma involves this cannon right here. This cannon in our yard came from Fort Ross. Remember, Sutter bought Fort Ross in 1841 for $30,000. He still owed $20,000 by 1848, and he owed thousands of dollars to other people as well. Sutter was a pretty terrible business person. And Sutter is faced with this dilemma because he has no workers here at the fort making anything. And so he's making no money. But all these people that he has owed money to over the years all come to collect at once because they think gold is found here at the fort, not 40 miles away at the sawmill, which was actually outside of Sutter's land grant. Sutter's faced with a dilemma. He's got no money, but he has a lot of land. And at the same time that he has to pay off these debts, business people have moved in. They want to set up shops to sell goods to the incoming gold miners. So that's what Sutter does. He starts to sell land to pay off his debts. The first pieces of land he sells is the fort. He sells the fort to about 12 different business people, and the fort is transformed from an agricultural and manufacturing center to California's first mall, selling goods to the incoming gold miners. No longer are items being made here at the fort. They're just being brought in by ship and sold at high prices. The items that everybody wants: mining equipment, shovels, pickaxes, tin pans, everything you need for gold mining. And that's how people who had a trade store here at the fort, like Sam Brannon, became California's first millionaire, selling goods to the incoming gold miners. Now, these merchants don't stay at the fort very long because here's the fort, 2 miles from the Sacramento River. It is right there along the Sacramento River is where ships are unloading goods. Incoming gold miners are getting off the ships there as well. So they want to have their stores there instead. And so they buy land along the waterfront, creating Sacramento City. Sutter's dreams of Sutterville fails. And when these businessmen leave the fort, they don't just take their supplies with them. They also take the lumber, they take the shingles, they take the bricks of their stores to build some of the first buildings in Sacramento City, where old Sacramento is today. By the early 1850s, large sections of the fort are gone. By 1862, only the central building remained. And that's what I mean by all that remained. It remained the only structure here at the fort until 1890. In 1890, even the central building was in terrible shape. It was going to be destroyed to build houses here in this area. But in 1890, the Native Sons of the Golden West, an early historic preservation group, purchased the central building and the 2 blocks of land for $20,000. They gifted it to the state of California, and they started to rebuild Sutter's Fort, which was finished in 1895. And we've been a museum ever since, telling the story of not only John Sutter, but all the people that came here to California and the role that those that were already here, the indigenous native population, their role in their history, and how all of these events leads to one of the largest migrations in human history, because of where all these people came to California for the gold rush. Now, I'm often asked, how do I know all this information? It's because I have read countless journals, diaries, firsthand accounts of people at the time that wrote stuff down that I was able to research and share with all of you. There's also native traditions of passing down oral history from one generation to the next, all these stories coming together to give this program to all of you. So I ask you during this time of, it's a new year, start to write down what you do each day, because you never know that in 100 years or 150 years, your diary or journal might end up in a museum or an archive or a library where somebody like me wants to research what was life like in 2022 from a child's perspective. So I want to thank you all for tuning in and watching my program here today at Sutter's Fort State Historic Park. I hope you learned something new, and come visit me. We are open from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. every day. Have a great day, everybody.